The chambermaid at an inn in Rochester feels something hard stitched into the lining of a guest's waistcoat, and she does not let go of it. It is the summer of 1696, and the coat she is folding has 1,045 gold sequins and 10 guineas sewn into its seams, more money than she will see in 10 years of turning down beds. She reports him. He is arrested within the hour, and he begins almost at once to talk. What he describes, to men who can barely believe the figures, is the richest single robbery any pirate crew has ever pulled off. A Mughal treasure ship boarded at the mouth of the Red Sea, a haul that ran somewhere between 325,000 and 600,000 pounds in gold, silver, and jewels, and a share out on a lonely beach that made ordinary sailors rich for the rest of their lives. The man in the waistcoat is not the one who planned it. The one who planned it is not in Rochester, and he is not anywhere the manhunt can reach, not that year, and as it turns out, not ever. His name is Henry Every, a slave ship's mate turned mutineer turned pirate admiral, and he is about to become the only architect of that heist who simply walks away from every part of what it cost. This is the story of how he pulled it off, what it did to an empire and to the men who followed him, and why, 3 centuries later, no one has ever found out where he went. At 9 o'clock on the night of 7 May 1694, in the Spanish harbor of Corunna, a ship's mate named Henry Every climbs quietly over the rail of a becalmed frigate called the Charles II, with about 25 men behind him and a plan he has spent a week building, man by man, watch by watch. The admiral of the little fleet, an Irish nobleman named Don Arturo O'Byrne, is ashore for the night. The ship's captain, Charles Gibson, lies in his cabin gravely ill, in no state to stop what is coming. Every does not need force. He needs only the men already moving toward him in the dark, and within minutes the ship is his. He has been building toward this moment since the previous August, when 4 English ships set out from London under a strange commission. A syndicate of investors, led by a merchant named Sir James Houblon, had won a charter from the Spanish crown itself. Sail to the Caribbean, trade and carry arms under Spanish colors, salvage what could be recovered from wrecked Spanish treasure galleons, and take a cut of everything. It should have been a 2-week run down to Corunna, on Spain's northern coast, to collect the paperwork that made the whole venture legal. It took 5 months. The commission never arrived from Madrid, and the 4 ships sat at anchor while their crews, unpaid since the day they left the Thames, watched the money they were owed evaporate into someone else's ledger. The wooden world of the age ran on this exact leverage, and every sailor aboard knew its rules from bitter experience. A merchant or naval crew was paid, if it was paid at all, only when a voyage ended, which meant an owner could always find a reason to delay, and a man who walked away before the reckoning forfeited every shilling owed him. At Corunna the trap tightened further. The ship's owners feared that paying the crews even a partial wage would let the men simply disappear ashore, so Houblon refused every request, and a petition sent home by the sailors' wives changed nothing. Men who had signed on to fight the French found themselves instead penniless prisoners of their own contract, eating through a Spanish summer with no legal way off the ship and no money to leave if there had been one. Every was not a random face plucked from the forecastle for this job. Born by the most careful modern reckoning around 1659 in the Devon village of Newton Ferrers near Plymouth, he had spent time as a midshipman and then a master's mate aboard the Royal Navy ships Rupert and Albemarle in the early 1690s, serving under Sir Francis Wheeler and probably present at the Battle of Beachy Head before his discharge in August of 1690 sent him looking for less regimented work. Contracted for roughly 2 years by the governor of Bermuda to carry captives from the Guinea coast of Africa to the Americas, and sailors working that coast in those same years already knew him well enough to give him a nickname, Long Ben, for his unusual height, though no one troubled to write down exactly why the name stuck. He came to the Charles II, in other words, not as an innocent pressed into a life of crime, but as an experienced seaman who had already spent years working the roughest edges of England's maritime commerce. Every, promoted to first mate on the Charles II not long before, had spent those months doing what a ship's mate does best, moving between decks, listening and talking. A crewman named William Phillips would later testify that Every went from ship to ship in the harbor, telling any man who would listen that he would carry them somewhere they could get money enough, On 1 May, the crews had put the demand plainly to their officers: 6 months back pay, or they would strike, and then refused again. 6 days later, an argument between the sailors and Auburn on the dockside seems to have turned the plan from talk into a date on a calendar. That the mutiny succeeded without a shot fired owes something to simple bad luck for the ship's defenders. Gibson's illness meant there was no one aboard to rally resistance, and the second officer, David Krieg, refused to join the plotters, but could do nothing alone. Men from a sister ship, the James, came alongside in a longboat using a password about a drunken boatswain, and slipped aboard to swell Every's numbers. When the James's own captain shouted down that his men were deserting, Every answered him calmly from the deck of a ship that was no longer anyone's but his own crew's, and the James opened fire, alerting the Spanish night watch on shore and forcing Every to cut his cable and run for open water rather than argue the point further. Once clear of the harbor, Every did something that separated this mutiny from an ordinary act of theft. He gave the loyal men a choice. Those who wanted no part of the venture, including the ailing Gibson, were set ashore in a boat before the Charles II stood out to sea, and only the ship's surgeon, whose skills the new venture could not risk losing, was kept aboard against his will. The men who remained then did what sailors of the account had done for 2 generations already, on ships from the Caribbean to Madagascar, and would go on doing for another 30 years. They held a vote. Every, a mate with no ship of his own, and no fortune to his name, was elected captain by a claim of the company he had just led into open mutiny, on the understanding that pay would run 1 full share to every man and 2 shares to him. Every man aboard had just watched a paper promise of wages go unhonored for 5 straight months. The new bargain, crude as it was at least one every man in the vote had a hand in making. The ship was renamed that night or soon after, Charles II, a name that belonged to the King of Spain, whose paperwork had stranded them, became Fancy, and Fancy she remained for every mile of the voyage that followed. Word of what had happened reached London within the year, in the form of a printed street ballad, kept afterward in a gentleman's private library, alongside his diaries of the age. Proof that a mutinous ship's mate was already, within weeks, becoming a story people wanted told, whether or not the man who lived it ever had a hand in the telling. Every himself had no time to enjoy the notoriety. A stolen 46-gun frigate with a hungry, unpaid crew and an empty hold was not yet a fortune, it was a problem, and the nearest solution lay south, down the coast of Africa, toward waters where a fast ship and a willing crew could still turn a name into money. The Fancy set her course for the Cape Verde Islands within days, and the first taking of the whole voyage, a trio of English merchantmen robbed not of treasure, but of food, rope, and sailcloth, was still weeks away. Every's first act of outright piracy is a small one, almost apologetic by the standard of what will follow. At the island of Mayo in the Cape Verde group, the Fancy stops 3 English merchant ships out of Barbados and takes not their coin, but their stores, provisions, rope, sailcloth, the unglamorous cargo that keeps a ship moving. 9 men off those ships choose to join him, rather than continue their own voyage, which brings the Fancy's company to something near 94, and establishes on the very first opportunity the pattern that will define this entire cruise. Every does not simply rob crews, he recruits from them, and merchant sailors keep saying yes. Down the Guinea coast the venture turns uglier. A local chieftain is lured aboard under the ordinary courtesies of trade, then relieved of his wealth, while his own men are seized and enslaved outright, the same trade Every had worked before he ever became a pirate, when he had spent 2 years running captives from that same coast for the governor of Bermuda under a legal license. A slave captain of the period, a Welshman named Thomas Phillips, who worked these same waters, later wrote in his own journal that the people along that stretch of coast had grown unusually wary of English traders, and blamed it on the tricks played by men like Long Ben, a nickname Every already carried by 1693, for reasons no one troubled to write down. The pirate captain and the licensed slaver were on this coast, barely different men, wearing different papers. At the island of Bioko, the Fancy is careened and cut down, razzied in the seaman's own term, stripped of her upper works to lighten her and raise her speed, and comes off the beach as one of the fastest ships then sailing the Atlantic. The work itself is unglamorous and exhausting. The ship is run aground at high tide, and heeled over on her side with block and tackle, so that her hull, black with weed and worm below the waterline, can be scraped clean, while carpenters cut away the heavy upper deck and poop that a merchant owner had once wanted for cargo space and captain's comfort alike, weight that a pirate crew has no use for and every reason to be rid of. A lighter, lower ship needs fewer hands to work her sails, and answers her helm faster, in exactly the kind of close, reef-strewn chase that the waters near the Red Sea would soon demand. Speed is not a luxury for a pirate crew, it is the entire business model, the difference between overtaking a laden merchantman and watching her sail away, and Every's decision to spend weeks on a beach improving a stolen ship, rather than simply using her as she was, tells you something about the seaman he was, whatever else he was. By October, the Fancy is off Principe, where 2 Danish privateers cross her path and are taken along with their cargo of ivory and gold. Roughly 17 of their crew, given the same choice every captured sailor of the age seemed to face, sign on rather than sail home. The company that rounds the Cape of Good Hope in the first weeks of 1695 numbers well over 100 men of at least 4 nations, and it is heading somewhere specific, the pirate havens of Madagascar and the Comoro Islands, the loosely governed stretch of the western Indian Ocean where, for a decade already, crews on the account had watered, refit, and waited for word of the one prize that made every other prize on earth look small. That prize sailed on a schedule as regular as a church calendar, and every sailor in these waters knew it. Once a year, the Mughal Empire, the vast Muslim state that ruled most of the Indian subcontinent under its emperor Aurangzeb, sent a great convoy of ships from the port of Surat, carrying pilgrims to Mecca for the Hajj and bringing them home again, and a fleet that carries the wealthiest households of an empire to the holiest site in their faith and back again does not travel light. Merchants converted their trading profits into gold and silver before the voyage home. Noble families traveled with jewels, plate, and coin beyond anything a European sailor would see in a lifetime of honest wages. The convoy was armed, but its guns were meant to deter opportunists, not a coordinated squadron of men with nothing left to lose. Madagascar itself, the great island the Fancy was steering for, had spent the previous decade becoming something like the pirate trade's unofficial capital. A coastline of small bays and river mouths where crews on the account could water, trade plunder for supplies, and winter in relative safety among settlements that answered to no European crown at all. Exactly where along that coast Every put in is less certain than the rest of his route. Most historians favor St. Augustine's Bay on the strength of the sailing directions of the day, though the detailed trading logs kept by other pirate factors working the island in these same years make no mention of the Fancy at all. A reminder that even a voyage this well documented still has gaps no single source can close. What is certain is that the island's reputation alone was doing real work for Every, drawing his growing company onward the way it had drawn a decade of pirate crews before him, toward a stretch of coast where a stolen ship and a wanted name mattered less than a full purse. At the Comoro Island the sailors called Johanna, the Fancy put in to rest and resupply, and the company grew again. A passing French pirate ship was taken along with roughly 40 of her crew, bringing Every's total strength to something near 150 men. It was here, in February of 1695, that Every did something unusual for a man already wanted for mutiny. He wrote a letter, addressed to any English ship's commander who might read it, insisting he had never harmed an English vessel and describing a private signal by which honest English ships could identify themselves and pass unmolested. Whether the letter was sincere or simply cover for what he already knew was coming, no one can say with any confidence, and it did nothing, in the end, to keep the English authorities from hunting him once word of what happened next reached London. What happened next required more men and more guns than even a Razid frigate with 150 hands could muster alone. And the waters around the Comoros and the Red Sea approaches were, that season, unusually full of men in the same trade with the same idea. A ship's captain in this line of work rarely announced his plans. He simply set a course, and if another captain's course ran the same way, an alliance formed itself on the water, the way it had formed a generation earlier among the buccaneers of the Caribbean. Every set the Fancy's course north, toward the mouth of the Red Sea, and toward company. By August of 1695, the narrow Strait of Bab el-Mandeb, the gateway between the Red Sea and the Gulf of Aden, holds more armed Englishmen than any single English port outside London itself, and not one of them answers to a king. 6 ships lie waiting near the small island of Param, watching the sea lane every Mughal pilgrim convoy has to cross, on its way home to Surat. Evry's Fancy, still the fastest and the most heavily gunned of the 6 with her 46 cannon, has been joined by Thomas II in the sloop Amity, Joseph Farrow in the Portsmouth Adventure, Richard Want in the brigantine Dolphin, William Mays in the smaller Pearl, and Thomas Wake in the bark Susanna. 5 captains, each carrying his own private commission from a colonial governor somewhere on the American seaboard, each nominally a legal privateer against some enemy or other, and none of them here for any reason but the one convoy that makes every other prize in these waters look like small change. The company that gathers under these 6 flags totals over 440 men, and a fleet that size needs one thing the scattering of independent captains cannot supply on its own: a single command for the moment the convoy actually appears. The obvious choice by seniority and experience was Thomas II, a Rhode Island-born privateer who had already made one legendary Red Sea cruise a few years earlier, sailing out with a single small sloop and a paper commission to raid French shipping, only to turn instead toward the same Mughal convoys that drew every captain in this fleet, and coming home so wealthy that his own colonial governor received him as a celebrity rather than a criminal. Every man in this flotilla had heard that story before he ever signed on, and II's presence here in person, still hunting the very same prize a second time, was as good as a recommendation. Every captain in the 6-ship fleet, in fact, sailed under a private commission of exactly this kind, a paper from some colonial governor authorizing war on a named enemy of the crown, and every one of them was, in practice, using that paper as cover for a hunt no honest privateer would have dared, implicating in the process nearly every English colony on the American seaboard, whose governors had signed such commissions without asking too many questions about where the ships actually meant to sail. The captains put it to a vote instead, the way pirate crews always settled the question of who led whom, and the vote went to Every. Rank in this fleet, as on every ship that flew no king's flag, belonged to whoever the company decided could actually do the job when the guns started, and on paper, Every's raised frigate and larger crew made the calculation for them. He did not have long to enjoy the title. The convoy the fleet had gathered to intercept, 25 Mughal vessels sailing together for protection, the year's whole traffic of pilgrims and merchants bound home from Mecca, slipped past the strait in the dark without being seen at all, and the 6-ship fleet spent the next several days simply trying to catch a target that no longer knew it was being hunted. The chase exposed, within days, how thin the alliance actually was. Want's Dolphin proved too slow to keep pace with the rest, and had to be burned outright, her crew taken aboard the Fancy, rather than left behind on a dying ship. II's Amity fell further and further astern, and never rejoined the flotilla at all. II himself, by most accounts, was killed engaging a separate Mughal vessel on his own, ending the career of the most famous Red Sea pirate of the age in a fight his own former partners never even witnessed. Wake's Susanna straggled so far back that she missed the fleet's first real prize entirely. What began as 6 ships and 440 men was down, within days of the chase beginning, to 3 vessels still capable of fighting together: Fancy, Pearl, and the Portsmouth Adventure, and the alliance that remained was no more sentimental than the one that had already dissolved. Every had won the vote that made him admiral of a fleet on paper. What he actually commanded by the time the pilgrim convoy came back into sight was whatever ship could still keep station on his own. And he had learned, in the space of a single chase, exactly how far a title voted at anchor carried once the shooting started. Somewhere astern of the hunt, unremarked in any surviving account, ordinary sailors aboard every one of these ships were doing the plain arithmetic of the trade, a share of whatever this convoy carried, divided among however many men still stood on however many decks were left when the fighting stopped. Weighed against the real chance of dying in a strait thousands of miles from anywhere their families could ever learn of it. It was the same bargain every merchant sailor of the age understood in his bones: risk weighed openly against reward, instead of a captain's unaccountable word. And it is the reason so many of them had chosen this strait over an honest ship's articles of wages they might never see paid in full. The convoy these 6 captains had gathered to intercept did not sail on a whim, and neither did the pirates who came looking for it. Mariners of the day had already given this stretch of ocean and the annual hunt that took place on it a name of its own: the Pirate Round, a circuit that ran from the Americas around the Cape of Good Hope to the Red Sea and the approaches to India and back again, timed to the same seasonal monsoon winds that carried the Mughal pilgrim fleet home from Mecca every autumn. Tew's presence at the head of that fleet was not simply prestige. On his first Red Sea cruise in 1693, sailing out of Bermuda under a privateering commission from that colony's governor, Isaac Richest, against the French, Tew had instead taken a single richly laden Indian ship largely without a fight and split a haul reckoned near £100,000 among a crew of barely 60 men, a sum that made an ordinary foremast hand wealthier in one afternoon than 20 years of honest wages could have made him. Word of that single voyage had done more to recruit men to this second attempt than any promise Every himself could have made, and Tew's own decision to sail the round a second time, when a man of his reputation could easily have retired on the first fortune, told every sailor in the six-ship fleet everything they needed to know about how much money was presumed to be waiting at the far end of this particular chase. Still unaware that a fifth of the fleet that had come to take her had already burned or scattered, sailed the escort of the year's Mughal treasure convoy, a merchantman more heavily armed than Every's own flagship, carrying the fortune of one of Surat's richest men, and standing, for a few more days, between the pirates and the far larger prize behind her. 4 or 5 days into the chase, the three ships still keeping station under Every's command run down their first real prize, the Fateh Muhammad, a Mughal vessel of some 3,200 tons, larger even than the treasure ship still ahead of her, carrying 94 guns to the Fancy's 46 and 800 men against Every's diminished company. On paper it was not a fight the pirates should have won without a battle worth remembering. It was over almost before it began, whether her crew had already been shaken by an earlier brush with Tew's amity, or simply took one look at 3 pirate hulls closing from 3 directions and did the same arithmetic every frightened sailor does. The Fateh Muhammad struck her colors with barely a shot fired, and Every's men went aboard to find a cargo that belonged, before that morning, to Abdul Ghaffar, reckoned the wealthiest merchant in the port of Surat. One English trader who did business with him for years would later describe him as a man who drove a trade equal to the whole English East India Company put together, fitting out, in a single ordinary year, upward of 20 ships of 300 to 800 tons apiece. More shipping than most European trading houses managed in a decade of careful business. It was this one merchant's fortune converted into coin and cargo and loaded aboard a single armed ship for the homeward run from the Red Sea that Every's diminished company had just taken in an action lasting barely long enough to be called a battle at all. The haul was real money by any standard a common sailor understood, somewhere between 50,000 and 60,000 pounds, enough by itself to have bought the Fancy 50 times over, and it should have felt like the fortune every man aboard had crossed an ocean chasing. It did not quite, because a prize taken by a fleet has to be shared by the fleet, whatever remained of it. Every's own crew, who had done most of the actual work of closing the trap, found their individual shares thinner than the total figure suggested, split as it was among men aboard ships that had barely fired a shot in anger. It was a lesson in the arithmetic of the alliance that would matter again very soon, once there was a far larger sum to argue over and far fewer ships left to argue with. Because the Fateh Muhammad, rich as she was, had never been the target. She was the escort, the armed merchantman sailing ahead of and around the one ship in the whole Mughal convoy that mattered, the vessel every captain in that scattered fleet had crossed 2 oceans hoping to see. A few days after the Fateh Muhammad struck her colors, lookouts on the Fancy raised her, the Ganj-i-Sawai, whose name meant in the Mughal's own tongue, exceeding treasure, and whom English sailors of the period anglicized simply as the Gun's-way. She was smaller in tonnage than the ship just taken, some 1,600 tons against the Fateh Muhammad's 3,200, but she carried 80 of her own guns, a musket-armed guard several hundred strong, and something close to 1,000 souls total between crew, guards, and the pilgrims and merchants she was carrying home from Mecca. She had been built decades earlier under the patronage of the emperor's own grandmother, a formidable dowager who had financed her own trading voyages to Mecca long before Aurangzeb's reign began, and by 1695 she was, by any reckoning available to the men now closing on her, the richest single ship afloat anywhere on the Indian Ocean that season. The Ganj-i-Sawai's reputation had preceded her long before Every's lookouts ever raised her topsails. English factors resident at Surat had written home for years describing her as one of the largest and most heavily built ships operating out of the port, a vessel Mughal officials treated less as an ordinary merchantman than as a floating extension of the imperial household's own prestige. Fitted with teak planking thick enough to turn aside the kind of light shot most pirate ships carried. It was exactly this reputation for near invulnerability built up over a decade of uneventful pilgrim voyages that had let her captain and her guard grow confident enough to sail this particular season with less caution than the ship and the fortune she carried arguably deserved. Only 3 of the original 6 pirate ships were still in a position to fight her when the moment came: Evry's Fancy, Mayas Pearl, and Pharaoh's Portsmouth Adventure, and even that number would shrink further once the guns opened. A pirate crew weighing whether to engage a ship that outgunned them, as the Ganj-i-Sawai's 80 cannon outgunned the Fancy's 46, was not weighing an abstraction. Every man on every deck understood exactly what round shot did to a human body at close range, and exactly how much money waited on the other side of surviving the exchange. It is worth pausing on that calculation, because it is the same one that had driven every step of this voyage since a stranded, unpaid crew first climbed over the rail of the Charles II at Corunna 15 months earlier. The same wager, run up now to its largest possible stake, on open water far from the nearest English harbor. The waters where this chase played out lay several hundred miles off the Indian coast, along the homeward leg of the Pilgrim fleet's route from the Red Sea towards Surat, open ocean, far from any Mughal naval base that might have sent help. A merchant convoy of this size normally sailed together for exactly this reason, trusting in numbers and in the deterrent bulk of its largest ships, rather than in any real appetite for a fight, and the fate of Muhammad's decision to strike her colors so quickly reflected a calculation her own officers had almost certainly made before the pirates ever closed the range. A merchant crew paid to carry cargo, not trained soldiers paid to die defending it, had little reason to risk annihilation against 3 ships, already flush with the momentum of a running chase, whatever her own paper advantage in guns and men. Evry's own fleet, for all its formal size on paper, was in practice a coalition of equals, rather than a single command answering to one admiral's word, and the decision to engage each new target still had to hold, in some rough working sense, the agreement of every captain whose guns would actually be doing the fighting. It was a fragile way to run a battle plan, but it was the only kind of authority these men had ever agreed to accept from one another, forged the same way Evry's own captaincy had been forged back at Corunna, by vote and by consequence rather than by any commission from a king. Ghafar's own losses in the taking of the fate of Muhammad were, by the standards of Surat's merchant class, catastrophic on their own. A single season's trading fleet gutted of its richest cargo in an action that had cost the pirates barely an hour, and word of it reached the port well before the far larger loss still to come did, giving the city's merchants and officials a full measure of warning about exactly what kind of men now lay across the homeward route, warning that would do nothing in the end to save the ship still coming up behind her. There was no council held on the Fancy's deck to debate the odds, no vote of the kind that had made every captain in the first place an admiral of the fleet soon after. The decision, when it came, belonged to whichever captain judged the arithmetic in his own favor fastest, and to whatever the guns themselves decided once the range closed. Evry gave the order to close on the largest, richest, most heavily defended ship any of these men had ever set eyes on, and the Fancy came up on the Ganj-i-Sawai's quarter with her gun ports already open. The first exchange of the battle decides more of it than either side yet knows. Every opening broadside catches the Ganj-i-Sawai's mainmast and brings it down by the board. A single lucky shot that strips a 1,600-ton ship of half her ability to maneuver or flee in the same instant it happens. It is the kind of moment that separates a battle every history book remembers from one that simply never gets told. Had that shot gone a few feet wide, the larger, better-armed Mughal ship might have run before the wind and left 3 pirate crews nursing their disappointment thousands of miles from home. Instead, the Ganj-i-Sawai sits dismasted and vulnerable, and the Fancy closes to finish what the first shot began. It is not a quick finish. A volley of musket fire from the Ganj-i-Sawai's own guard, 400 men armed and ready, against boarders trying to scale a hull far taller than their own, drives Evry's first attempt to climb aboard back off the sides entirely. For a moment, the fight could still have gone the defenders' way. The Mughal ship carried enough men and enough weapons. The contemporary Indian historian Kafi Khan would later insist that a competent defense should have beaten the pirates outright. What broke the defense instead was an accident of gunpowder, rather than seamanship. One of the Ganj-i-Sawai's own cannon burst on her own deck, killing a number of her crew outright, and shattering whatever discipline remained among the rest, who abandoned their posts to fight the fires the blast had started, or simply fled below. Evry's men and the crew of the Pearl, who by most accounts had hesitated to engage a ship so much larger than their own, until this exact moment, climbed the sides in the confusion and gained the deck. What followed was close, ugly, and slow, a hand-to-hand fight lasting, by most estimates, somewhere between 2 and 3 hours, fought with cutlass, pistol, and boarding pike across a deck already burning in places from the exploded gun. Kafi Khan's account, gathered from testimony collected afterward in Surat, describes the ship's captain, a man named Muhammad Ibrahim, abandoning the fight on deck to arm slave girls below decks and send them up in his place, a detail Khan includes as an indictment of Ibrahim's own courage, rather than a neutral fact, and one no other surviving account confirms independently. Ibrahim himself, taken prisoner, would later insist that his own men had inflicted real losses on the boarding pirates, and the numbers back at least the shape of his claim. Evry's outnumbered crew suffered casualties historians still cannot pin down with any confidence, estimates ranging from several dead to over 100, in a fight that was never as one-sided as the eventual surrender made it look from a safe distance. Was less a decision than a collapse. A ship's company that had lost its captain's direction, lost a working mast, and lost the will that only comes from believing a fight is still winnable, simply stopped resisting deck by deck, rather than all at once. What the pirates found once the fighting stopped justified every mile of the chase and every man lost reaching this exact hour. The Ganj-i-Sawai's hold and cabins held something on the order of 500,000 gold and silver coins, along with jewels, plate, and fine goods beyond easy counting, and how much the whole haul was actually worth would be argued for years afterward by men with every reason to shade the number in either direction. The Mughal court, seeking the largest possible reparations from the English crown, put the figure near £600,000. The East India Company's own auditors, hoping to pay out as little compensation as they could justify, called it closer to £325,000. Split the difference, or believe whichever side you trust less, and it still stands as one of the largest single hauls any pirate crew has ever taken from one ship in the whole history of the trade. Richer, by any of the competing tallies, than anything Evry's own crew had dared imagine back at Corunna 15 months before, when the whole enterprise had begun with a handful of men owed 5 months of wages that had never come. Only a small handful of pirate hauls in the whole recorded history of the trade have ever been argued to rival it, a Portuguese galleon taken off Réunion a generation later among them, and by most tallies, even that later prize fell short of what the Ganj-i-Sawai alone had carried. What that fortune actually looked like, spread across the ship's cabins and hold, was not simply a heap of coin. Alongside the 500,000 or so gold and silver pieces sat chests of cut and uncut gemstones, gold dust, fine cloth, and platework, the accumulated wealth of merchants and pilgrims who had spent months converting a season's trading profit into exactly the kind of portable riches a long voyage home required, never once imagining that a fast, razeed English frigate lay waiting for them at the one narrow gate every ship on this route had to pass through. There is a version of this story, still repeated more often than the record supports, in which Evry himself finds something aboard that mattered more to him than the coin, a high-born woman of the Mughal court, sometimes named as a daughter or even a granddaughter of Emperor Aurangzeb himself, taken as his own private prize, while the rest of the crew divided the gold. It makes for a better legend than the evidence allows. What contemporary East India Company sources actually record is a female relative of the emperor's household aboard the ship, without confirmation of exactly how close that relation was, and nothing in the surviving depositions of Evry's own crew, who described the boarding as something every man took part in by turns, not a captain's private hunting ground, supports the idea that Evry set any one captive apart from what the rest of the company did in the hours and days that followed. The gold, at least, is beyond dispute. Everything that happened next aboard the captured ship is not. What happened aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai in the days after her surrender is documented by two kinds of witness, who had no reason to agree with each other, and their agreement is what makes the record hard to dismiss as later exaggeration. Kafi Khan, the Mughal court historian working from testimony gathered in Surat soon after the ship limped home, described several days of systematic brutality, prisoners tortured for the location of hidden valuables, and sexual violence against the women aboard so severe and so prolonged that, in his account, some of the women chose suicide over what continued captivity promised them. It is one man's account, gathered second-hand, and it would be easy to read it as a hostile chronicler, making the enemy as monstrous as the story required, except that the second kind of witness is the enemy's own men, speaking against their own interest, with a rope already waiting for them. Philip Middleton, one of Every's own crew, captured and deposed months later in London, testified plainly that several of the captive men were murdered, that prisoners were put to torture, and that Every's men lay with the women aboard, his own words, given under oath, by a man with every incentive to minimize his crew's conduct, rather than confirm a hostile chronicler's account of it. John Sparks, another crewman who would hang for this voyage before the year was out, used his last public words not to repent of piracy itself, which he treated as a lesser matter, but specifically for what his own confession called the barbarities committed on the bodies of the captives, a distinction that says as much about the casual racism of the age as it does about the acts themselves, and one worth sitting with rather than passing over. A letter from Sir John Gayar, the East India Company's governor at Bombay, written that October to his superiors in London, adds a third strand. He reports, second-hand and by his own admission only as he heard it, that a high-born woman of the Mughal court traveling home from her own pilgrimage to Mecca was abused so severely that one person of quality aboard, along with his wife and her nurse, killed themselves rather than let the husband witness what was being done to them. Kafi Khan himself is worth knowing a little about, since so much of what can be said about these 3 days rests on his account. He was a Mughal official and historian, working within a generation of the events he described, compiling his history from court records, correspondence, and the testimony of officials who had handled the affair directly, a method that makes him neither an eyewitness nor a disinterested outsider, but a chronicler working close enough to the original sources that his account carries real evidentiary weight, even whereas with the fate of Ibrahim's own conduct, his framing clearly serves to condemn rather than simply describe. Estimates of how many people were actually aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai when she struck her colors vary by source, but the figure most often cited, several hundred pilgrims and merchants beyond her crew and guard, is enough on its own to explain why what happened next reached an empire's capital as something closer to a massacre of the faithful than an ordinary act of maritime robbery. It is worth pausing on where these accounts actually come from, because the answer says something about why this particular crime, out of everything piracy of the era produced, left such an unusually detailed paper trail. Middleton and Sparks did not volunteer their testimony out of conscience. They spoke under oath in London, months later, as men bargaining for their own lives with an admiralty court that already had every reason to hang them, and a confession offered in that position carries its own kind of weight, not because such men were suddenly honest, but because minimizing their own crew's brutality would have served their interests far better than admitting to it. That they admitted to it anyway, in specific and consistent enough terms to be entered into the trial record, is itself part of the evidence. None of these 3 accounts, the hostile Mughal chronicler, the guilty pirate crewman, and the alarmed company governor, agrees on every particular. And a careful telling of this story is to say so plainly, rather than smoothing the gaps into one clean narrative. What they agree on, independently and for entirely different reasons, is the shape of it, that for some number of days after the fighting stopped, the men who had just won the richest prize in the history of their trade subjected the ship's surviving passengers, and especially its women, to torture and sexual violence on a scale severe enough that it was still being written about, argued over, and confessed to years later by men on 3 separate sides of the story who otherwise agreed on almost nothing. It is worth saying clearly what this was not. It was not, whatever the later legend preferred, a single dramatic abduction of one high-born captive by a love-struck pirate captain. The popular version of this story, still repeated in books and documentaries 3 centuries on, holds that Every personally took for himself a daughter or even a granddaughter of Emperor Aurangzeb, and the honest answer is that no contemporary source actually supports it. What the East India Company's own men recorded at the time was only that some female relative of the imperial household was aboard, with no confirmation of exactly how closely she was related to the emperor, and Middleton's sworn deposition describes access to the captives as something the whole crew shared in turn, rather than a captain's private prize. The truth, as far as the surviving record allows anyone to reconstruct it, is both less romantic and considerably worse than the legend. Not one captain claiming one prize, but an entire ship's company given days of unsupervised license over hundreds of terrified, defeated people, on a vessel far from any authority that could have stopped them. The ship that eventually limped back into Surat carried, along with whatever coin the pirates had left behind, news that would travel through the Mughal Empire far faster than any single treasure figure could. This had not simply been a robbery. It had been an assault, in the middle of the holiest pilgrimage of the Islamic calendar, on pilgrims returning from Mecca itself, a violation the Mughal court and the ordinary people of Surat alike would treat as something closer to sacrilege than to ordinary piracy, and one that put every Englishman then living or trading anywhere in India in immediate and very personal danger. The gold from the Ganj-i-Sawai had already been split among the surviving pirate ships, and would soon be split again, man by man, on a distant beach. The reckoning for what had happened alongside that robbery was still to come, and it would fall first, not on the men who had done it, but on Englishmen who had never left India at all. News reaches Surat before the damaged Ganj-i-Sawai herself limps into harbor, and it arrives already shaped by outrage rather than mere loss. Robbery on this coast was an old, familiar cost of the sea trade, priced into every voyage the way storms and fever were. But this had been done to pilgrims coming home from Mecca, and the sexual violence woven through the robbery made it, in the eyes of the Mughal court and the ordinary people of Surat, something closer to sacrilege than to crime. The governor of Gujarat, a man named Itamad Khan, moves immediately to arrest every English subject he can find in the city, not entirely as punishment, since he understands as well as anyone that these particular Englishmen had nothing to do with the attack, but as protection, because a furious crowd in Surat is by this point entirely capable of tearing an East India Company clerk apart for the crime of sharing a nationality with the men responsible. The emperor's own response, once it reaches him, goes considerably further than crowd control. Aurangzeb, who rules over more people and more territory than any other monarch on earth at this moment in history, closes 4 of the East India Company's trading factories outright and imprisons their officers, and by several accounts comes close to ordering an outright military assault on the company's fortified base at Bombay, an act that would have ended English trade in India in a single stroke, and unwound decades of patient, expensive diplomacy in a matter of weeks. This is not an overreaction born of a single incident in isolation. The company's own trade with India had already collapsed from a peak of some £800,000 a year in the mid-1680s to barely £30,000 by 1695, battered by an earlier war between the company and the Mughal Empire that neither side had fully recovered from, and Evry's raid landed on that already fragile relationship like a match dropped in dry grass. To understand why one merchant ship's robbery could shake an empire this size, it helps to understand the empire itself. Aurangzeb's Mughal domain in 1695 stretched across virtually the entire Indian subcontinent, an empire of perhaps 150 million people, larger in population than all of Europe combined, and wealthier, by most contemporary estimates, than any other single state on earth. A trading company representing a small island kingdom off the northwest coast of that same continent held its position in India entirely by the emperor's forbearance, a fact the East India Company's own directors in London understood with far more clarity and far more anxiety than the pirates who had just given Aurangzeb every reason to reconsider that forbearance. What the East India Company's officers in Bombay and London understood immediately, and what every reader of this story should understand alongside them, is that Aurangzeb held every card that mattered. The company's entire presence on the subcontinent existed at the emperor's sufferance. It had no army capable of matching his, no fleet that could hold a coastline against a determined Mughal response, and no alternative source of the textiles, spices, and trade goods that made the whole enterprise profitable in London. If Aurangzeb chose to expel the English from India entirely, there was very little the company or the crown behind it could actually do to stop him. The company's response, forced by simple weakness rather than any excess of conscience, was to promise Aurangzeb full financial reparations for the raid, money the company itself had not stolen, paid to compensate for a crime committed by men who had never worked for the company a day in their lives, purely to keep a trading relationship worth vastly more than the ransom alive. Back in London, Parliament's own response to the crisis shows exactly how seriously the whole English establishment now took the problem Evry's crew had created. Piracy against merchant shipping was an old nuisance, prosecuted as ordinary robbery when it was prosecuted at all. What Evry's crew had done was declared something categorically worse. Parliament named pirates of this kind hostis humani generis, an old Latin phrase meaning, roughly, the enemy of all mankind, a legal category that stripped men like Evry of the ordinary protections a criminal might expect, and marked them as fair targets for capture or killing by any nation's forces anywhere in the world, without the usual formalities of jurisdiction or extradition. It was the language of a government that understood it was no longer simply chasing thieves. It was trying to repair a diplomatic wound that threatened the entire English foothold in India, one of the most valuable pieces of overseas trade the kingdom possessed. Calico cloth, raw silk, indigo dye, saltpeter for gunpowder, and pepper all flowed west out of Mughal ports on company ships, paid for in exactly the kind of silver the Ganj-i-Sawai had been carrying home, and every one of those cargoes depended on an emperor who now had every reason in the world to close his ports to Englishmen entirely, rather than take the risk of another Evry. The practical response followed within months. In the middle of 1696, the English government put up a bounty of £500 for Evry's capture, together with a free pardon for any informer who helped bring him in, and the East India Company, which had far more at stake than the Crown's pride, doubled the combined reward to a full £1,000, an enormous sum for an informer to earn simply by naming a name. The Board of Trade in London took direct charge of coordinating the search, drafting a description of the wanted men detailed enough to be read aloud from a church porch or nailed to a harbor post in any English-speaking port on earth, and every governor of every English colony from the Caribbean to New England received orders to watch for the Fancy and her crew. It amounted in scope, if not in modern technology, to the first manhunt in history, conducted on a genuinely global scale, ships and proclamations reaching out across 4 continents in pursuit of a single stolen fortune and the men who had taken it. At the very moment those men were still congratulating themselves, an ocean away, on having pulled off the richest robbery any of them had ever heard of. Evry himself still somewhere in the Indian Ocean, with a hold full of gold, and no idea yet how large a hunt his own crew's conduct had set in motion, had one piece of business left before that hunt could even properly begin, dividing a fortune large enough to make every man who had survived the fight rich for the rest of his natural life, on a beach far from any government's reach. At the Isle of Bourbon, a French-held island in the Indian Ocean, well clear of any Mughal or East India Company patrol, the pirate fleet finally does what every man aboard had crossed an ocean and fought a battle to do. It counts the money. In November of 1695, the surviving ships anchor together, and the company divides its haul, and the figure that reaches each ordinary crewman, something close to £1,000 a man, with an additional share of loose gemstones on top, is not an abstraction to men who had spent their working lives measuring wages in shillings. An honest merchant sailor of this period earned perhaps 25 to 55 shillings a month, £20 a year if he was lucky and steadily employed, which most were not. £1,000 represented for a common seaman more money than an entire working lifetime of honest wages could have produced, delivered on a single afternoon on a beach that belonged to no navy and answered to no customs house. Bourbon itself, a French colony still thinly settled by planters and their enslaved workers, asked no questions of the armed foreigners anchored offshore, and its distance from any English or Mughal patrol was exactly the point. A stretch of coast where a fleet with a fortune to divide could do the one piece of business that mattered, without a magistrate or a naval lieutenant within 1,000 miles of the Count. Bourbon had been a French possession for barely 30 years by the time Evry's fleet dropped anchor there, settled first by a handful of French planters and the enslaved workers they had brought from Madagascar and the African coast to grow the island's earliest crops, an economy still small enough and a colonial government still thin enough that armed foreign ships anchoring offshore to conduct their own private business drew curiosity rather than any serious challenge. The coin the pirates counted out that November was itself a currency of the wider world rather than any one nation. Pieces of 8 and Mughal gold mohurs and Venetian sequins passing through the same hands on the same afternoon, a reminder that the money this crew had taken respected no single empire's borders any more than the men spending it did. The counting itself settled nothing about how the men would carry that fortune home, and it is worth pausing on the practical problem. £1,000 in gold and silver coin actually posed to a sailor with no bank, no lawyer, and a hangman's proclamation already circulating in every English port he might try to land in. Coin of that size does not fit easily into a sea chest without inviting exactly the kind of attention that had already sunk half the pirate crews of the previous generation. It gets sewn instead into the linings of coats, hidden in the seams of ordinary clothing, carried ashore a few coins at a time rather than declared all at once, a habit every man on that beach would already have understood without being told, and one that would matter again, for at least one of them, sooner than any of them expected. The alliance among the captains, never more than a marriage of convenience struck at anchor, off a strait none of them had chosen for sentimental reasons, did not survive the count intact. A dispute broke out between the crews of Evry's Fancy and May's Smaller Pearl over clipped coin, shaved or trimmed currency worth less than its face value, a common enough fraud in an age before reliable minting standards, and evidently common enough grievance among men already primed to suspect each other of cheating. Evry's men, by the more reliable accounts of what happened, simply confiscated the Pearl's share outright rather than negotiate the dispute, which tells you something about where real power sat within this alliance once the fighting was over, not with the vote that had made every admiral back at the Strait, but with whichever crew happened to be strongest and least willing to be cheated at the exact moment the argument came to a head. Pharaoh's Portsmouth adventure, which had observed the taking of the Ganj-i-Sawai from a distance without joining the actual boarding, received nothing at all from that particular prize, a hard but consistent application of the same principle that had governed every pirate share-out since the buccaneers of the previous century first wrote the custom down: no fight, no share, whatever the crew's private feelings about fairness. Before the fleet finally scattered, Evry's men handed Mays a token sum on the order of 2,000 pieces of eight to buy supplies for the voyage home, a small gesture of goodwill, or perhaps simple insurance against a wronged captain talking too freely once he reached a friendly port. And then the ships that had fought and quarreled together for the better part of a year went their separate ways for good. A fortune this size changes a crew's arithmetic as much as it changes any one man's. Every ship still had to feed and man itself, still faced the ordinary risks of storm, fever, and reef that had nothing to do with pirates or emperors, and a company of men who had each just become richer than they had ever expected to be in one lifetime, had for the first time in this whole voyage more to lose by staying at sea than by going home. It is one reason the great alliance that had gathered 6 ships at the Strait broke apart so completely once the count was finished, not simply from quarrels over clipped coin, but because the one prize worth this much risk had already been taken, and no man with £1,000 sewn into his coat needed to explain to his shipmates why he was ready to stop. What is worth noticing, looking back at the whole arithmetic of this venture from the vantage of that beach, is how little of the promise that had started it all had actually survived intact. The mutiny at Corunna had been, at bottom, a revolt against unpaid wages, a broken promise on paper, months of labor that a syndicate of London investors had simply declined to honor. What Evry's crew had built to replace it was not some careful, principled alternative. It was a system exactly as rough and exactly as prone to one strong party simply taking what it could from a weaker one, dressed up in the language of shares and votes rather than wages and contracts. The gold at least was real, and it was theirs, sewn now into coat linings and scattered among a dozen ships bound for a dozen different harbors. The empire that intended to take it back from them, one man at a time, was already moving. While Evry's fleet was still counting gold on a beach off Bourbon, the paper that would hunt them across 4 continents was already being drafted thousands of miles away, and it moved, once it started moving, faster than any ship could outrun it. Governors in every English colony from Jamaica to Massachusetts received the same proclamation within months of each other. A description of the Fancy, a warning that her crew could likely be recognized by the sheer quantity of foreign gold and silver coin they were carrying, and an order to arrest any man matching that description on sight. A pirate crew flush with Mughal treasure faced a peculiarly modern problem for the 1690s. The money itself, in coin no honest English sailor should plausibly possess, was evidence of the crime it paid for. which is exactly why so many of them had already taken to hiding it stitched into ordinary clothing, rather than carrying it openly. What made this hunt different from every pirate manhunt that had come before it was not its intensity, but its scope. Individual pirate captains had been chased by individual colonial governors for a generation. What pursued Every's crew was closer to a coordinated national project, run out of London's Board of Trade, with the full weight of both the Crown and the East India Company behind it, because both institutions had concluded, correctly, that their own survival in India depended on being seen to punish this crime with unusual severity. The English government went further with Every personally than with any other pirate of the era, when a general act of grace, a blanket pardon offered periodically to pirates willing to surrender and return to honest life, was issued in 1698. Every was explicitly named as exempt from it, along with every future pardon the Crown would offer for years afterward. Other men of the account, even men with worse reputations for cruelty, could eventually buy their way back into lawful society. Every by name could not. It was a distinction the Crown had never before bothered to draw for an individual pirate, and it turned Every into something closer to a permanent legal category than an ordinary wanted man, a name that no future act of royal mercy, however broad, would ever again be allowed to cover. The men who had followed him understood their situation with the plain clarity of sailors who had spent their whole working lives calculating odds. A common seaman of this period who wanted to disappear into the wider Atlantic world with a fortune in his coat lining had in practice 3 directions to run: south and west into the loosely governed islands of the Caribbean, where a friendly colonial governor's greed might outweigh his loyalty to a proclamation from London; north into the American mainland colonies, where a fortune quietly spent could buy silence from officials a very long way from any real oversight; or east, back across the Atlantic toward home, where a man's own accent and his own family might shelter him, even as that same accent made him instantly recognizable to anyone looking. None of the 3 paths was safe. Every colonial governor now had orders from London to arrest suspicious sailors carrying unexplained foreign coin. Every port city had jewelers and goldsmiths who had been quietly warned to report customers trying to sell uncut Indian gemstones, and every one of Every's former crew was, in effect, choosing not the safest road, but simply the one whose particular dangers he understood best. Every's own company split almost exactly along these lines in the weeks after Bourbon, and the choice each man made would decide more than any pirate's cunning ever could, which of them would eventually hang, and which would simply vanish into an ordinary life. One ordinary sailor's calculation is worth pausing on, because it captures something the grand sweep of empires and proclamations tends to erase. A common crewman on this voyage, unnamed in most surviving records, one face among the 150 who had sailed this far, had, in the space of about 2 years, gone from an unpaid conscript stranded on a Spanish quayside to a man carrying, sewn into his own clothes, more coin than his father or grandfather had earned across an entire working life. For men like this, the manhunt that followed was not an abstraction about empire and diplomacy. It was the difference between spending that fortune quietly on a farm in the Carolinas for the rest of a long life, or standing on a scaffold above the Thames within 2 years of the ship's return. Both outcomes, in the end, happened to different men who had stood on the very same deck. The proclamations themselves, once drafted, traveled by whatever ship could carry them, which meant that even the most urgently worded warning from London might take 2 or 3 months to reach a governor in Jamaica or Boston, an ordinary delay that gave every one of Every's scattering crewmen a real, if temporary, head start on the paperwork meant to catch them. The Board of Trade's own correspondence from this period shows officials in London growing steadily more frustrated with colonial governors who seemed, in report after report, oddly slow to act on descriptions that had been circulating for months, a frustration that had less to do with any one governor's individual loyalty and everything to do with the plain economics of a small colony suddenly presented with wealthy strangers willing to spend freely and ask for very little in return. The East India Company's own agents, meanwhile, worked a second, quieter angle on the same problem, circulating word among the goldsmiths and jewelers of London and the larger port towns that any customer offering unusually large quantities of foreign coin or uncut Indian gemstones for sale should be reported rather than simply served, a strategy that would, within a year, prove far more effective at actually catching Every's former crew than any government proclamation nailed to a church door. It was, in its way, the same lesson piracy itself had always taught the men who practiced it and the officials who chased them. Money spent quietly disappears into an economy without a trace, but money spent carelessly in a port town where everyone still remembers exactly how poor a sailor was 6 months earlier draws attention faster than any manhunt can. Few of Every's former shipmates fully appreciated, in the first weeks of freedom, just how effective that second, quieter kind of hunting would prove to be. Every himself set the Fancy's course west, across the widest ocean any of them had yet crossed, toward the one stretch of English territory in the whole Atlantic world, still governed loosely enough and defended thinly enough, that a captain, with money to spread around, might reasonably hope to buy his way ashore. It was not London he was sailing toward, and it was not yet home. It was a half-ruined little settlement in the Bahamas, governed by a man whose own colony's survival depended on exactly the kind of hard, self-interested bargain Every was about to offer him. In March of 1696, the Fancy drops anchor off Royal Island, near Eleuthera in the Bahamas, some 50 miles short of the little settlement of Nassau, and 4 of Every's men take a small boat ashore, carrying a letter for the island's governor, rather than simply sailing the ship straight into harbor. It is a careful, businesslike approach for men who by this point know exactly how much a wanted proclamation is worth to the wrong official. And the governor they are writing to, a man named Nicholas Trott, is about to make a calculation that says as much about the state of English colonial government in the 1690s as it does about any one man's greed. Nassau in 1696 is barely a colony at all, in any sense a Londoner would recognize. A scatter of clapboard houses and a half-rebuilt fort sit above a harbor that had already been sacked twice in the recent war. Its official population, a few hundred settlers scraping a living from salt, timber, and whatever trade happened to put in. Its garrison numbers somewhere between 60 and 70 men, with only half on duty at any given hour, defending 28 cannon that are themselves undermanned. French raiders have already taken the nearby island of Exuma and are widely feared to be planning a move against New Providence itself before the year is out. Trott's own annual salary as governor runs to some £300. The offer that reaches him from Every's men, £860 in coin, on top of 50 tons of ivory, 100 barrels of gunpowder, several chests of firearms and ammunition, a set of ship's anchors, and the promise of the Fancy herself as an eventual gift, is not simply a bribe in the ordinary sense of a man being paid to look the other way. It is, calculated coldly, an offer that would double the defensible male population of an undermanned island facing a real and immediate French threat, delivered by 113 armed men who could just as easily become that threat themselves if Trott refused them. Trott himself was not a stranger to this kind of arrangement before Every's crew ever appeared off Eleuthera. He had made his career moving between colonial posts in the Caribbean, first in Bermuda and then in the Bahamas, in an era when a governor's salary was rarely enough on its own to explain the comfortable life so many of them managed to build. And the historical record of his tenure in Nassau shows a man who treated the boundary between public office and private profit as considerably more flexible than London's instructions ever intended. None of that made him unusual among his peers so much as typical of them, a colonial official navigating a system that paid him too little to refuse an offer this large, and a colony too weak to enforce a refusal, even if he had wanted to make one. Trott took the deal, and the historical record suggests he took it with his eyes open to exactly what he was doing. He convened his own governing council and secured its approval to let the ship enter harbor, almost certainly without telling the council about the private bribe waiting for him personally, and told Every's crew in public that they were welcome to come and go as they pleased. When word of the manhunt eventually reached the Bahamas, Trott would claim he had no particular reason to disbelieve the men's story, that they were honest privateers rather than the most wanted pirates in the English-speaking world, a claim that sits uneasily against a proclamation already circulating that named the very fortune in foreign coin these men were visibly spending as the surest way to recognize them. The Fancy herself did not survive the visit. She was eventually stripped of everything valuable and lost, driven onto rocks in a wreck that several accounts suggest was no accident at all, but a convenient way for Trott to make the one piece of physical evidence that could have proven his own complicity simply disappear beneath the waves. What this single transaction reveals, more clearly than any proclamation from London, is the actual limit of imperial power in the 1690s Atlantic. A government in London could declare a bounty, exempt a man from every pardon, and coordinate a manhunt across 4 continents, and none of it mattered in the least the moment it met a colonial governor whose own survival depended on a different, more immediate arithmetic than the Crown's. Trott was not a uniquely corrupt man for his age. He was simply an ordinary official making the same calculation any of his counterparts across the Caribbean might have made, weighing a distant king's displeasure against a very present threat of French guns and an empty treasury, and choosing the money and the muskets that were actually in front of him. The same pattern would repeat itself, in one form or another, in almost every underdefended English colony these men eventually reached. A lesson every one of Every's former shipmates seemed to have absorbed before they ever needed it. The wreck of the Fancy herself, whatever role Trott's own hand played in arranging it, solved a problem for more people than just the governor. A stolen 46-gun frigate, however useful to a struggling colony's defenses on paper, was also the single most identifiable piece of physical evidence connecting an English governor to a pardon he had never been authorized to grant, and her disappearance beneath the rocks off Nassau Harbor removed that evidence as completely as a burned proclamation would have removed a warrant. When investigators eventually arrived from London to examine exactly how 113 of the world's most wanted pirates had been allowed to walk ashore in an English colony, they found a governor with a plausible story, a wrecked ship that could confirm none of it, and a settlement full of ordinary Bahamian colonists who had, whatever their private opinions of the arrangement, benefited directly from the sudden influx of gunpowder, firearms, and hard currency the pirates had brought with them. The bargain gave Every's crew exactly what they had crossed an ocean for: a quiet harbor, a chance to come ashore without immediate arrest, and time to decide, man by man, where each of them would go next. It did not give them safety, only a head start, and even that head start would not last. Word of the manhunt was already crossing the Atlantic behind them, and a governor who had taken one bribe to let 113 wanted men ashore was not a man who would risk his own neck protecting them once London's attention actually turned toward his own small, underdefended colony. The crew that had fought together at the Ganj-i-Sawai and quarreled together at Bourbon now had one final decision left to make, individually rather than as a company, and it was the decision that would separate the men who eventually hanged from the one man who never would. From Nassau, the company that had sailed and fought together for the better part of 2 years finally comes apart for good, each man choosing a direction according to his own read of where the manhunt was least likely to reach him. Some stayed in the West Indies, gambling that island governors as pliable as Trott could be found further along the chain. The larger share, something near 75 men, sailed for the North American mainland, the Carolinas, New England, and Pennsylvania, where at least one group is said to have paid the colony's own governor, William Markham, roughly £100 a man for protection, and where a magistrate named Robert Sneed, who tried to arrest them, found his own governor actively blocking the attempt. A fortune sewn into a coat lining, it turned out, bought a remarkably comfortable retirement in a colony far enough from London that the Crown's writ ran thin and a governor's own pocket ran deep. Men who had spent the better part of 2 years sleeping on a crowded deck now had the means to buy land, livestock, and silence in roughly equal measure, and more than a few of them appear to have done exactly that, settling under invented names into ordinary colonial lives that no proclamation from London ever managed to unravel. The men who chose the American mainland over the Caribbean were, in a real sense, betting on distance and time, working in their favor, rather than on any single governor's goodwill. A colony like Pennsylvania in the 1690s was still a young, thinly administered project, its governor answerable to proprietors an ocean away in London who had neither the resources nor, in William Markham's own case, the personal inclination to police every wealthy new arrival too closely. Men who had spent 2 years learning to read a ship's crew for signs of mutiny or betrayal turned out to be reasonably good judges of which colonial governments could be trusted to look the other way, and the fact that so many of them guessed correctly says as much about the real limits of English royal authority in the 1690s Atlantic as it does about any individual pirate's cunning. Every chose neither direction. He and roughly 20 of his most trusted men took passage instead on a sloop called the Seaflower, under a captain named Farrow, bound not for the Caribbean or the American mainland, but back across the Atlantic toward Ireland, the most direct route home for a man whose accent, whose family, and whose entire life before the mutiny at Corunna had been rooted in the west of England. They arrived toward the end of June 1696, and immediately ran into the same problem that had dogged every pirate trying to spend Mughal gold in an English-speaking port. Men unloading a fortune in foreign coin and jewels draw attention, however carefully they try not to. Two of the party were caught almost at once. Every was not among them. What happened to him after that landing is, by the honest standard any careful historian has to apply, simply unknown. This is worth stating plainly rather than gesturing past it, because the temptation in telling this story is always to fill the silence with whichever ending feels most satisfying. And 3 centuries of writers have done exactly that. One tradition printed in a widely read history of piracy in 1724 has Every dying in poverty in Devon a few years later, cheated out of his diamonds by unscrupulous Bristol merchants who bought his treasure for a fraction of its worth and left him, in the book's own harsh judgment, not even worth the price of a coffin. It is a satisfying moral for a book aimed at discouraging its readers from a life of piracy, and that is precisely the problem with trusting it. There is no plausible way its author could actually have known such a private, unwitnessed fact, and a story that happens to teach exactly the lesson its teller wanted to teach should always be read with that motive in mind, rather than accepted at face value. A second tradition holds that Every changed his name entirely, settled quietly somewhere in Devon, and lived out an ordinary life before dying around 1714, a claim resting on nothing sturdier than a later, admittedly unreliable reprint of the same 1724 book. A third, gathered nearly a century after the fact by a customs official in Cornwall, who happened to meet a man claiming descent from Every, holds that his father had told him the old pirate died a pauper in the town of Barnstaple and was buried without ceremony, a story passed down at least 2 generations removed from anyone who could have actually witnessed it, told by a stranger to another stranger, for reasons neither man's motives can now be checked. None of these 3 endings can be verified, none of them can be entirely ruled out either. Each was written or told by someone with a reason of his own for preferring that particular ending, a moralist wanting a villain punished, a family wanting a name to remember, a public that simply could not accept that a man could vanish from the richest manhunt of the age without a trace worth trusting. What can be said with real confidence is only this. After that June morning in 1696, when a small boat put Henry Every and his gold ashore somewhere on the Irish coast, no reliable account of his life, his death, or his whereabouts survives in any archive anyone has yet found. What makes Every's own choice of Ireland worth pausing on, set against his crew's choice of the Americas, is how much more exposed it left him to exactly the kind of recognition that had doomed men like Dan. Ireland in 1696 was English territory in every legal sense, patrolled by English officials who had received the same proclamations as every colonial governor in the Caribbean, and a man landing there with a fortune in foreign gold ran a real risk of the same kind of scrutiny that had already caught 2 of his own party almost as soon as they came ashore. That Every chose this route anyway, rather than the more anonymous distances of the American mainland his own crew had judged safer, suggests either a man drawn home by ties stronger than his own caution, or a man who had already decided, having pulled off the richest heist in the history of his trade, that the last leg of the gamble was worth running on his own terms rather than his crew's. For the men who had sailed with him, the silence that swallowed their captain would not extend to them. The gold that had bought passage into Ireland and 100 pounds of protection in Pennsylvania was, for most of Every's former crew, only a temporary shield, and the manhunt that had failed to find their captain was about to close in on the men who had sailed with him instead. At an inn in Rochester, Kent, on the 30th of July, 1696, a chambermaid going about the ordinary work of tidying a guest's room feels something hard and irregular sewn into the lining of a waistcoat left folded on a chair, and does what any sharp-eyed servant with a reward proclamation fresh in her memory would do. She reports it. The coat belongs to a man named John Dan, once Every's own coxswain aboard the Fancy, and stitched into its seams, the authorities find 1,045 gold sequins, along with 10 guineas, a fortune hidden in plain sight, in the single most ordinary garment a traveling man could own, exactly the way Every's crew had learned to carry their wealth back at the Isle of Bourbon 8 months earlier. It is the same trick that had let a dozen men slip quietly into new lives across 3 continents. For Dan, on this particular afternoon, it fails. Within days, facing near certain execution for piracy on the Ganj-i-Sawai, Dan does what a rational man in his position does. He agrees to turn King's evidence, testifying against his former shipmates in exchange for his own life, joining another crewman named Middleton who had already come forward on similar terms. His testimony and the physical evidence of goldsmiths and jewelers around London who had grown suspicious of customers trying to sell unusually large quantities of foreign coin and uncut gems gives the authorities exactly the thread they need to start pulling former crewmen out of ordinary English life one by one. It is worth noticing how the manhunt actually succeeded where it did, not through some clever piece of detective work by the Board of Trade, but through the same small human carelessness that undoes most fugitives. A coat left unattended, a coin spent somewhere it should not have been, a stranger with too much money and not enough explanation for it. 24 of Every's men are eventually rounded up across England and its colonies, men who had scattered to the Carolinas, to Pennsylvania, to quiet corners of London itself, each believing, as Dan had believed right up until a chambermaid's hands found the wrong seam, that a fortune carried carefully enough could simply disappear into an ordinary life. Not all of them face trial, and fewer still are convicted. Of the 24 men taken, 15 are eventually brought before a court, and only 6 are found guilty and sentenced to hang, a conviction rate that says something honest about how difficult it actually was, even with informers and physical evidence in hand, to prove exactly which men aboard a single crowded deck had done exactly what during the chaotic hours after the Ganj-i-Sawai surrender. Some of the men taken had genuine claims to have been forced aboard against their will, pressed or recruited under threat rather than joining willingly. And English courts of this period, whatever their eagerness to make an example of piracy in general, still required at least the appearance of individual proof before hanging a specific man for a specific crime. Across the Atlantic, meanwhile, the crew who had bought Governor Markham's protection in Pennsylvania discovered that £100 a man bought more security than the law technically allowed. When a local magistrate named Robert Sneed attempted to arrest several of Every's former crew living openly in the colony, Markham himself intervened to block the arrests, protecting men he had personally profited from sheltering, a small, ugly footnote to the whole affair that illustrates in miniature exactly the same lesson Governor Trott's Bahamas bargain had already taught. Colonial officials thousands of miles from London answered first to their own immediate interests, and only second, if at all, to the Crown's stated policy. Every attempt at prosecution in Pennsylvania eventually failed. The men Sneed tried and failed to arrest lived out their retirements there in relative peace, protected by the very governor whose office existed, on paper, to enforce the law against them. Middleton, the other crewman, whose deposition had already described the killings and the assaults aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai in plain terms, disappears from the surviving record almost as completely as Every himself, once his testimony had served its purpose. One more reminder that this story's evidence survives in patches, offered by men buying their own safety, rather than in any single continuous account anyone can simply read straight through. Among the 24 men eventually taken, the range of fate says something about how unevenly this particular reckoning fell. Some were caught within weeks of Dan, undone by the same carelessness with a fortune they had never had occasion to hide before. Others evaded capture for years, surfacing in the record only when age, illness, or a final unlucky transaction finally caught up with them. A handful, protected by governors like Markham or simply lucky enough to settle somewhere no informer ever thought to look, appear to have died as ordinary, unremarkable colonists decades later, their one extraordinary year at sea, known only to themselves and whichever descendants they eventually told. The unevenness of it was, in its own way, the final lesson of the whole voyage. A crime this size, however carefully an empire tried to answer it with proclamations in courts, still came down in the end to which individual men happened to get careless, which governors happened to be greedy rather than cautious, and which coat happened to end up in front of a chambermaid sharp-eyed enough to feel what was sewn into it. Dan himself, having bought his life with testimony against his former shipmates, went on to build something close to a respectable existence out of the wreckage. He married in 1699, became a partner in a London banking house with a goldsmith named John Coggs, and ran that business for a decade before it collapsed into insolvency in 1710, undone in a detail that has its own bitter irony, by a client's fraud rather than his own former life of piracy catching up with him. He died in 1722, an ordinary London tradesman by the time of his death, having survived by trading a shipmate's silence for his own life, and then simply outliving the story entirely. The 5 men who did not have Dan's evidence to sell, and did not have Every's luck in vanishing entirely, would face the one part of this whole affair that the English legal system had built specifically, deliberately, and with unusual public attention to get right, not because the Crown particularly cared about 6 ordinary sailors, but because an acquittal, as one of the judges overseeing their case would say to the jury in almost exactly these words, risked nothing less than the total loss of England's entire trade was India. The first trial opens at the Old Bailey on the 19th of October, 1696, with 6 defendants in the dock: Joseph Dawson, Edward Forsyth, William May, William Bishop, James Lewis, and John Sparks. The same Sparks whose later confession would dwell on the barbarities committed against the Indian captives, rather than on piracy itself, facing a formal charge of piracy committed aboard the Ganj-i-Sawai. The bench assembled to hear the case is unusually heavy for a piracy trial. Sir Charles Hedges, representing the Admiralty, Sir John Holt as Chief Justice of the King's Bench, Sir George Treby as Chief Justice of Common Pleas, and 6 further judges besides. A panel that tells you plainly how seriously the Crown intended this particular prosecution to be taken. The courtroom itself was, by every account of the period, packed well beyond its ordinary capacity, London having followed the Every affair in print for the better part of 2 years by this point, and the diplomatic stakes riding on the verdict were common knowledge to everyone crowded into the gallery long before the judges took their seats. Only Dawson enters a guilty plea. The other 5 stand on not guilty, and the prosecution builds its case around witnesses including David Craig, the one officer of the original Charles II who had refused to join Every's mutiny at Corunna and lived to describe under oath exactly how the takeover had happened. It should have been, by any reasonable expectation, an easy conviction. Instead, despite a direct warning from the judge advocate, Sir Thomas Newton, that acquitting these men risked, in his own words to the jury, the total loss of the Indian trade, and thereby the impoverishment of the entire kingdom, the jury returns a verdict of not guilty on every defendant still contesting the charge. It is a genuinely startling outcome, and it exposes a real weakness in how English law of this period actually handled evidence gathered an ocean away from the courtroom. Witnesses were few, testimony had to survive months of travel and translation, and 12 ordinary Englishmen sitting in judgment on their countrymen were, it turned out, considerably less willing to hang 5 sailors on the word of a shipmate and a single loyal officer than the Crown's own lawyers had assumed they would be. The Crown's response to this failure shows exactly how far the government was prepared to bend its own legal machinery once a first attempt had failed. 12 days later, the same 5 men face a second trial, not a retrial on the same charge, which double jeopardy would have forbidden even in this period, but an entirely new indictment, this time for conspiring to feloniously and piratically run away with the ship Charles II itself. A charge constructed specifically to shift the practical burden onto the defendants to explain their innocence of mutiny, rather than requiring the Crown to prove piracy on the high seas all over again. Judge Hedges opens proceedings by publicly rebuking the previous jury's verdict as dishonorable and urges the new jury, in language calculated to leave no doubt what verdict was expected of them, to judge the case with what he called a true English spirit. This time the jury convicts. The legal maneuver that produced this second trial was not, in itself, unprecedented. English Admiralty law of this period had long allowed prosecutors some latitude to reframe a failed case around a different charge arising from the same events, but the speed and the transparency with which it was deployed here, a fresh indictment built within days specifically to secure the verdict the first jury had refused to give, drew its own share of comment from London observers uneasy at how nakedly political the machinery of justice had just shown itself to be. It was a discomfort that changed nothing about the outcome, but it lingered in print and in private correspondence for years afterward. One more piece of evidence that this case had never really been about 5 ordinary sailors at all. The sentencing that follows makes plain how thin the line was, in this legal system, between mercy and its absence. Dawson, the one man who had pleaded guilty from the start, receives a reprieve rather than the rope, a small, telling reward for cooperation at the other 5, having gambled on a full trial, and very nearly won at their first attempt, do not share. William May offers the defense that illness had prevented him from taking any active part in the mutiny or the piracy that followed. William Bishop, only about 18 years old at the time of the mutiny itself, argues he had been carried away, against his own better judgment, by older men. Neither defense moves the court. Of the 6 men originally charged, 5 now stand condemned to hang, and only Sparks among them uses his final public words not to protest his innocence of piracy, but to express genuine remorse, specifically in the language of his own printed confession, for the horrid barbarities he had committed, though only on the bodies of what his own words call the heathen. It is a small, ugly window into an entire era's moral arithmetic. A condemned man could go to his own execution troubled in conscience about cruelty toward Indian captives, while apparently untroubled about the robbery, the mutiny, or piracy itself. On the 25th of November, 1696, 5 men, Forsyth, May, Bishop, Lewis, and Sparks, are hanged at Execution Dock on the bank of the River Thames, in the traditional spot reserved for maritime crimes, their bodies facing the same river from which the Spanish expedition shipping venture had first set sail a little over 3 years before. The symmetry was not lost on anyone who followed the case closely at the time. The whole affair had begun on this river's water with 4 ships and a Spanish commission that never arrived, and it ended here too, with 5 men swinging above the tide that had once carried them out toward what they had believed, at the very start, was nothing more than an honest voyage for honest wages. Dan, whose testimony had helped convict the men now hanging, was not among them, and neither, of course, was Every himself, the one man whose name had launched the whole global hunt, and the one man who was, by this point, simply nowhere any court could reach him. The empire had its executions, its reparations paid to a satisfied Mughal court, and its example made of 5 ordinary sailors whose chief crime, in the court's own framing, had been following orders on someone else's ship. What it did not have, and would never have, was the man who had given those orders in the first place. By the time the last of Every's convicted crewmen were cut down from the gallows at Execution Dock, the man who had led them there was already becoming something considerably larger than the sailor who had climbed over the rail of the Charles II 2.5 years before. Within a generation, the pirates who would define the era historians now call the Golden Age of Piracy, Blackbeard, Bartholomew Roberts, Calico Jack Rackham, Samuel Bellamy, Stede Bonnet, had all grown up hearing some version of every story, told and retold in taverns and broadsides, before any of them had ever set foot on a pirate deck of their own. One of them, a minor captain named Edward England, admired the story closely enough to rename his own flagship the Fancy, and model an entire career on Every's example, only to end his own life marooned and destitute on Mauritius, the exact fate a later writer would falsely assign to Every himself, as if the legend had simply been waiting for someone to actually live it out. That later writer was Charles Johnson, whose General History of the Pirates, published in 1724, did more than any other single book to fix Every's story in the form the public still remembers today. Johnson's account has Every cheated out of his fortune by dishonest Bristol merchants, and dying eventually in such poverty that he could not afford his own coffin, a vivid, morally satisfying ending for a book explicitly designed to discourage its readers from a life of piracy, and one with a fairly obvious problem. There is no plausible way its author could have known any such private, unwitnessed fact about a man the entire English state had failed to locate for nearly 3 decades. A man who had genuinely died poor and traceable in an English port town would very likely have been found and hanged for the enormous reward still standing on his head. The tidy moral ending, in other words, may say considerably more about what an author of that era wanted his readers to believe about the wages of crime than about anything that actually happened to Henry Every. The legend did not stop at a fictional death. An earlier fictional memoir, published in 1709 under an author's invented name, had already gone much further, marrying Every to a daughter of the Mughal emperor himself, and installing him as the ruler of a pirate utopia on Madagascar, complete with his own coinage, an army in the thousands, and a fleet of warships, a fantasy so widely believed at the time that European governments reportedly received self-styled ambassadors claiming to represent Every's imaginary Madagascar kingdom, and Peter the Great of Russia reportedly explored recruiting the pirates of that supposed island paradise to help found a Russian colony there. None of it was true. All of it spread because a story with a genuine unresolved absence at its center, invites exactly this kind of invention, and 3 centuries of writers, playwrights, and novelists have been only too happy to fill every silence with whatever fantasies suited their own moment. A stage tragedy playing to London audiences in 1712, whose author was accused by at least one contemporary critic of turning the stage into an encouragement to villainy rather than a warning against it. A place in Daniel Defoe's own fiction less than a decade later, and echoes still turning up today in television and video games built loosely around his name. Even the black flag popular imagination now assigns to him rests on no firmer ground than the rest of the legend. No reliable contemporary account describes any pirate flag ever actually flew, and the specific skull and crossbones design, most often shown under his name today, was invented by a novelist working 2.5 centuries after Every himself disappeared. What actually happened is both more modest and in its way more remarkable than any of the myths that grew up around it. A ship's mate, radicalized by 5 months of unpaid wages on a stranded Spanish commission, led a bloodless mutiny, sailed a stolen frigate around half the known world, and orchestrated, with considerable seamanship and even more considerable luck, the single richest act of piracy the Atlantic world had ever recorded, a haul that historians still cannot price with any precision, because the men who stood to gain or lose from the number never stopped arguing about it, but which stood by any honest reckoning among the largest any pirate crew has ever taken from a single ship. One historian of piracy has gone so far as to argue that only 2 or 3 times in the whole of recorded history have criminals anywhere taken a richer prize. That heist came paired inseparably with an atrocity severe enough to nearly cost the East India Company its entire foothold in India, and grave enough that Every's own men would go to their own executions confessing to it specifically, apart from and beyond the piracy itself. The ground itself has gone on quietly confirming pieces of this story long after the archives went silent. In 2014, a single Arabian silver coin turned up in a plowed field on a farm in Rhode Island, and more followed in the years after across New England and the Carolinas, coins that any careful numismatist can trace back to the exact Mughal mints the Ganj-i-Sawai and the Fata Muhammad were carrying home from, dropped or spent or buried by crewmen living out the quiet, well-funded retirements this chapter has already described. The dirt, it turns out, has been a more reliable witness than most of the men who wrote this story down. And then, having done all of that, Henry Every simply walked away from every consequence the rest of his crew would go on to pay. 24 of his former shipmates were eventually caught. 6 were convicted. 5 hanged above the Thames at the exact spot their voyage had begun. Every himself was never arrested, never tried, never confirmed dead by any account a careful historian can actually trust. He is, among all the men who ever pulled off a defining crime of the golden age of piracy, essentially unique in having gotten away with it completely, not through some elaborate final trick, but through the much simpler, much stranger fact that after a small boat put him ashore in Ireland in the summer of 1696, the historical record that had tracked him with such unusual care across 3 continents simply had nothing further to say. He did not need to build a legend. An empire's manhunt, an author's morality tale, and 3 centuries of readers hungry for an ending did that work for him, filling a silence he left behind with every story except the one nobody has ever actually been able to prove. That the legend outgrew the man so quickly and so completely is, in the end, its own kind of evidence. An empire capable of hanging 5 ordinary sailors above the Thames within a year of their crime proved entirely incapable of closing the one case that had started the whole chase. Somewhere off the coast of Ireland, in the last days of June 1696, a small boat put a handful of passengers ashore and then pulled away again. One of the men who stepped onto that beach carried, sewn into his coat, more gold than most Englishmen would see in 10 lifetimes, and no one standing on that shore had any reason to remember his face. He walked inland, and the record, which had followed him with such unusual care across 3 continents, simply stops. No arrest, no grave anyone can verify, no last sighting that is ever held up. 3 centuries of bounty hunters, biographers, and treasure seekers have filled that silence with 100 different endings. A pauper's grave in a Devon town, a fortune signed away to crooked Bristol jewelers, a secret kingdom on Madagascar with its own coinage and its own ambassadors, and not one of them can be proven. because the paper that convicted his crew, tried his crew, and hanged his crew was never able to write his own name into any of it. Every other captain of this story's age ended on a gallows, in a courtroom, or in a quarrel with his own men. Henry Every is the one who walked past the harbor and simply did not stop walking. The horizon he left behind him is still empty. By every honest reckoning of the evidence, it always will be.